going tonight? Had a little interruption in the schedule. Sorry about that. A couple things happened. Ultimately, I was sleepy and decided I didn't want to stream. And then we were going to do Civilization 7 on Friday with a good. But Homeowners Association sent around a group of fix the trim on my windows right in time for them to be of absolutely zero use as spring is here. Yeah. So I had to cancel that on account of the fact that they would have been working on my while I was trying to stream. This week got messed up, but we're back. And make matters better or worse, depending on how you look, have a full schedule for you tonight. The whole 9 yards. Uh, did have a little bit of interesting times this week. Last Sunday's show certainly upset the Trump supporters or the Russians or both. Boy, were they mad. No, Donald Trump was bullied by Zelensky. That's definitely how it worked. I gotta say, if Donald Trump supporters are running around finding 600 sub YouTube podcasts to try to yell at about, they're in a lot more trouble than I. One of the things I've noticed, and everyone else seems to have noticed as well, is every time that Donald Trump goes forth and sets out one of his stupid policies, he has to turn around and revoke it because stupid. No, but only after he has attempted to convince everyone that it was a great idea all along and we just have to delay its implementation. So, what you have is Donald Trump who is surging forward ahead on dumb ideas and then turning around and retreating sheepishly from them. And he's retreating on all fronts. So I think it really is a sign of the times that the American government is going to be mired in utter ineffectiveness for the next 4 years, largely due to ideological based stupidity, resentment, and ultimately, it's unnecessary. And reading that Spanish Civil War book you recommend, good read. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Um, a lot of times I have to ask other people about things if it's outside my area of specialty. So I'm glad that worked out. I did have to ask about that. Um, we don't do enough teaching the Spanish Civil War in college settings or at all in high school settings. I think because it presages so much in Europe after after the end of the war. Yeah, that's going to be Trump's story. It's just going to be retreat on all fronts while desperately trying to tell people. For example, Pete Hegseth today tweeted out that the Department of Defense doesn't do climate change thing, only warfighter and mission planning. And I thought to myself, does he not understand that climate change affects military bases, affects aircraft, affects deployments, affects strategic concerns around the globe? The military does do climate change stuff. Mostly they sit and bang their heads against the wall while everyone ignores climate change. One of those weird things where the military refuses to be politically involved because climate change is a political issue, but the ultimate politics of the issue are what is determining that the United States military will be less effective going forward as things like Diego Garcia sinks or, superstorms hit bases all over the world. And it's this weird thing about reactionaries is they can never truly govern because they're so preoccupied with making someone pay for the little stupid things they don't. And I guess it works on that they don't have a plan to govern and don't have the capability to do, which is unfortunate because we are Americans and live here in this country, and this country because it also puts out a lot of greenhouse gases. Well, I can't help you. Some people are forced to carry plants because they don't do anything else useful. Help. I'd also point out I'd also point out that the greenhouse gases emitted by the military are nothing compared to most. And the first place I'd be looking is, well, industrial try to slow down greenhouse gas emissions. No, only God decides the climate. I guess ultimately, love. God is love. Sorry, I don't know where that came. Sunday brought up ultimate Judeo-Christian. That's why it's in my head. His fault. Blame him. // forward slash. I used Grammarly. All right. So, Civilization 7 has just come out to mixed. I like it better than Civilization 6. However, that was a low bar because I despised. It's okay. It's it has some of the it has some of the things I enjoyed from 6 without all of the nonsense, which brings it up. And this is from a channel whose name escapes me. And I'm just going to preface this. It was disappointed. Suede Civ 3. Civilization 3 is my favorite Civ, and that's probably where we're going to be focusing on this. Where I'm going to focus, because that's the one I know the best. But let's talk. He asks, how communist is civilization? And I think this is kind of an interesting question, because games are a way that a lot of people interface with history. We talked a couple, I forget, about Hearts of Iron 4 and its shallow interpretation of history. And I'll be frank, Civilization kind of has the same problems in a different way. Whereas Hearts of Iron and Victoria 3 and Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, let you kind of play out on a map with real world pieces. And Civilization gives you real world pieces and lets you play it out in entirely random. And one of the things that it has done traditionally is set up government systems, have those governments have certain attributes. This is, by and large, an expression of gameplay, but also it's where people take their concepts of history to a certain extent. This can be bad because certain things about civilization are ordered for the for example, Civ 3 has a technology called gun, and this not surprisingly unlocks gunpowder units for the time. A musket man, or if you're French, a musketeer. After that, you can research further, go to metallurgy and get cannons. So cannons end up coming after guns. Generally speaking, cannons are easier to build than pain than miniaturizing a thing is hard. Building a bigger thing is usually, unless it was designed. So the cannon comes out of order, and you might get the impression that later case civilization also uses different government. Traditionally, things like democracy, republic, uh, are not really different than here they are as different technologies and different governments. Communism. Civ 3 had fascism and feudalism, and despotism has always been the first form of government. And that's really where this focuses. And this is, I confess, disappointing. We'll go and get into it, but like, it's an interesting thing. But let's take a look.
There is a specter haunting the Civilization franchise, and that is the specter of communism. I can't think of another ideology that has been so fervently demonized as the root of all evil, while also being venerated by its supporters as the answer to humanity's prayers. It's like the 1 unit per tile of political ideologies. With such polemic discourse around the topic, how do you put that in a game? Just like assign numbers to how it performs, like it was a leather belt in World of Warcraft. Civilization was released
So this is, I think, a good point, that the government ultimately is a representation of what the designers saw it as. So we're starting off, like, I think, really strong here, and that's sad because what comes afterwards. The ultimate point, though, is that the truth of the ideology can be obscured by how we.
In 1991,
Is my audio cutting out, or am I just shutting up and being quiet at inappropriate times?
just a few months before the fall of the Soviet Union. But sadly for Francis Fukuyama, history has not ended yet. More Civ games have been made, and it's interesting to see how.
I'm going to be a little technical here. Francis Fukuyama doesn't think history ends insofar as that things don't happen. He thinks history ends in that liberal democracy is the ultimate expression of governance for people, and that nothing else will ever get past this. This isn't really the case, obviously. We have seen our own civilization uh, begun to descend into authoritarianism. So it seems there is something beyond democracy and liberalism. It seems that it's, bad.
Political ideology has changed in the series. Which Civ games are the most communist? We'll take a look. But before we begin, I will warn you, in this video, I will make fun of specific communist countries. This video could also be read as me making fun of communism as a whole. Alternatively, depending on what you had for breakfast this morning, you could also read it as ironic glorification of communism. If any of these possibilities offends you, then I don't know. Sorry, I'm not really good at this video essay stuff. I was told that after the revolution, I'd be a coal miner, but then they put a gun to my head and told me I had to make YouTube videos. I apologize sincerely for that outburst, comrades. Before the mainline games, let's start with two spin-offs. Alpha Centauri is set in a world where neoliberalism and the international order has failed. Numerous ideologies are represented within the game, including some that could be interpreted as a flavor or offshoot of communism. On the other hand, you still have liberals, religious fundamentalists, and hardcore capitalists. On a scale from boot stamping on the human face forever to fully automated luxury gay space communism, I give this game an all of the above. Civilization
That was, I don't even know what to make of that.
Revolution is a little different. Much like actual communism, I thought this game was the coolest thing in the world when I was 14, although I eventually realized that it made things too simple in a way that was a little suspicious. Also, this game has the word revolution in the title. This is the most communist game in the franchise. On a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being communist cars and 10 being communist national anthems, I give this a 10. On to Civ 1. This game has only 5 governments. Communism is positioned as an endgame form of monarchy, and democracy is positioned as an endgame alternative to republic. So endgame governments have a very Cold War-style dichotomy, where democracy and communism face off. This makes sense. When civilization was being designed, the Soviet Union had not yet collapsed. Civ 1 also had to make choices about what leaders to include, and they went with Mao Zedong and Stalin. There are no communist wonders or buildings, although there is a communist tech. This tech leads to labor unions, although historically, I'm not sure how well the two of them got along. Altogether though, communism had a strong showing and focus in this game. On a scale of communist-friendly media ranging from Red Dawn to Battleship Potemkin, I give this game an 8 out of 10. Civilization 2.
So this is the ground on which we're kind of working. You can already tell. Shallow. There isn't much commentary about what communism is in the game, except that it's an endgame tech. That's the word. Technology. Form of government. And like the thing of it is, it's Civ 1's case, I can forgive that because Civ 1 is pretty simple. There are elements introduced in Civilization 2, which was the first one I played, that really changed the state of the game. Things like waste as a offshoot of your production and corruption as an offshoot of your money. Like I have 20 money, but I'm 15 squares away from my capital, so I only get 15 of it. Stuff like that.
2 followed closely in Civ 1's footsteps. However, there are some key changes. Civ 2 introduced the spy, which is an important Soviet tool when it comes to failing to blackmail the French. We also got the supermarket, which has the special effect of making Boris Yeltsin switch into anarchy. Civ 2 gave us the fundamentalist government. Now, I know that earlier
Right. Civilization 2 is very different from the other games in that it has a number of features, such as completely broken world wonders. So, for example, the Statue of Liberty built fairly early on in the tech tree. They're not distinct ages the way they were in other games, later games, but you can build the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty allows you to select any government type you want, yeah, regardless of whether you've researched it or not. And fundamentalism is in the game, kind of like an Islamist or a religious fundamentalist type representation. And it is easily the most broken thing I've ever seen in my life in a game. It just takes all of the systems that are in place to like slow you down, like unhappiness and waste and corruption, and just eliminates them. And you can build things by stacking caravans or trade units and outside a city and sending them in and using them to add to the production of the city. So you put enough of them out there and you build a wonder in one turn. Civilization 2 is a wild game if you can get your hands on it. Just absolutely buck wild. It's great. It's easy as pie to break, but it's just a buck wild game.
Governments are still viable, but before, democracy and communism were definitely presented as a dichotomy at the end of human social advancement, so communism's grip on the narrative is starting to slip just a little bit. Civ 2 also changed a lot of the leaders. You can now play as Scheherazade. That doesn't have anything to do with the video, but the Ben Franklin stuff is seeming a lot less weird by the minute. Crucially, in place of Stalin, you can now play as Vladimir Lenin. Probably a step up. On a scale of how much did they help communism grow, from Trofim Lysenko to Che Guevara, I give this game a 7 out of 10. Civilization 3 is a bit of a return to form for communism. The Russians now no longer have a communist leader, but the government itself is quite strong, being the only viable alternative to republic.
So this is a interesting point, and I'm going to talk about this one for a while because it's the game we know best. Communism is a industrial age government. Hey, Bad Science Sunday, welcome. It's an industrial age government, and like it has this thing which is particular here. You'll see corruption and waste. That is the level of how it operates, and it assumes that it is communal. And what that ends up meaning is all the cities that you have suffer the same corruption and waste. So, like, this is an interesting point. Does that really reflect what we saw in history with the Soviet Union or China? It doesn't. It doesn't. Like, we know that graft and corruption are endemic in communist Russia or in the Soviet Union, are endemic in today's China. Like, China builds cities all the time, and there's nothing in them. Why? Because someone purchased the right to do it. So I think there's an interesting thing to say. Did we not hear me say welcome? Hi, everybody from Bad Science Sunday. We're talking about games and communism. Like, there's something interesting to say that is getting lost in his analysis of, like, memes.
Public in the game. Feudalism was added, which if you're a Hayek fan might be communist, and fascism was added, but it's absolute shit. It also sucked in Civ 3. Communism was the only government given a special small wonder, the Secret Police HQ, and Civ 3 ramped up corruption quite a bit, making the unique, corruption-mitigating effects of communism stand out. A joke was included here in the first draft of my script, but after a kind donation from the Politburo, it has been cheerfully withdrawn. On a scale ranging from Sadimir Lenin to Chadimir Lenin, I give this game an 8 out of 10.
And now we've left the realm of memes, I understand, altogether.
However, in a development that shocked everybody, communism could not keep up the momentum forever. Civilization 4 introduced religion, and even the title theme was a Swahili version of the Lord's Prayer. The boys are back, and the Kremlin was...
Guess what? The title theme for Civilization 4 is fire. You should go listen to it. after the show.
At it as a wonder, but communism has been removed as a government. Instead, governments have split into a series of civic choices. State property is only one of the 25. Universal suffrage, free speech, and emancipation are here, and they're very strong. Now, you might try state property and find that it doesn't work very well for you. But now, people can claim that you didn't try real communism, and that to do so, you would need an exact basket of civic policies that function as a moving target. So we can say that real communism has never been tried, but how is communism supposed to be good in this game if we can't even agree what it is? Also, the supermarket is back.
There's a point. Like, the games change how they represent government, and you don't necessarily get the lesson that you would think is there. So, like, again, communism is just a label. It's a Band-Aid you put on top of the game for the purpose of playing the game. This is why these games are not historical. Like, they're not good teachers of history because they introduce to you concepts that have nothing to do with the historical concept. It's the trappings of history placed around a game. And for what it's worth, the game is fun. Like, these are popular games. There's 7 of them for a reason. But ultimately, like, this concept that some people take away where I'm doing this game and learning history, isn't a thing that's happening. Like, the analysis only lends itself to this shallow nature, not to the things that are really, like, deep, like, understandings of the topic.
And the shopping mall too? Broadway? Rock and roll? No. On a scale of how pointless was this self-sabotage, ranging from the Sino-Soviet split to the Sino-Albanian split, I'm gonna give this a 5 out of 10. And things don't get better in Civ 5. Anarchy has been removed, so no more glorious revolutions. Microtransactions have been added, communist leaders have been removed. We do have this one new communist wonder, but to all my Chinese viewers who have overcome this wonder to watch my video, 你好, 不要在你的首都建造法院. Instead of the Cold War dichotomy,
Hey, screw you too, buddy.
From Civ 1, the endgame is split between 3 ideologies. So we don't take center stage here as much, but if you want to recreate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, you are now more easily able to do so. And while the Kremlin is back and orders policy options reference communist history, I can't help but notice that explicit references to communism itself have been scrubbed from the game. It used to be a social policy, but this was removed in Brave New World. This is...
Yeah, it's wrapped in frustrating political theory and discourse. Well, yes, but not really political theory, mostly just discourse. And the thing about it is, like, these games are simplified so that you are, not actually running an economy, because that's horrible and not fun in any way, shape, or form. Like, Janet Yellen is probably going to die of stress. But, like, the challenge there is that it makes people think they are engaging with history.
Something that a true communist, of course, would never do. In terms of renewing the strength of communism within the franchise, on a scale from Gorbachev to Ho Chi Minh, I give this a 4 out of 10. But hey, at least we still have Pizza Hut. Civilization 6 is more of the same. There are now 12 different governments, and communism becomes basically obsolete by the end. There are more wonders and leaders than ever, but none of them are communist. It does appear a bit in terms of policy cards and some of the picks for great people, but you can tell it's fading a bit into the background here. And in a devastating final blow, Civ 6 introduced blue jeans. Now, all of the other Civ games will be importing this feature via black market mods. The cultural pressure is just too much to withstand. This is a 3 out of 10. Now, the jury is still out on Civilization 7, but I believe it might be...
I think that's about the end of what we're going to do here. The issue, again, is the game supposed to advance an ideology? No, not really. And that's kind of where this video is at. And I guess my disappointment comes in that the game itself is fun. The series is fun, but we should not expect games to take the place of serious analysis. And that's the disappointment. Like, Is civilization communist? No, not really. So like you end up with an expectation that people bring, and then they bring it into their debates about modern politics. That, oh, I've studied history, I've played Total War, or I've played Civilization, or I've played Europa Universalis, and that's just not really what's happening. You're playing a game, you're having a good time, good for you, but understand the limits of what the game is, even if it is ostensibly historical. And with that, I owe everyone the finished touch of Mr. Terry's History versus Whatifalthist. Although I only see 6 likes. Make more likes, people. Fancy likes. Avery gets happy when we have more likes. We left off with Whatifalthist talking about Europe and what Europe will look like in the 22nd century.
Comparison to the Greeks and Romans is very apt, in which the Romans tried to liberate the Greeks from the Macedonians, and then the Romans, who greatly respected the Greeks, tried various self-governance from the Macedonians, and then the Romans, who greatly respected the Greeks, which the Romans tried to liberate the Greeks from the Macedonians, and then the Romans, who greatly
liberate them from what? The Persians? Is that what he's saying? They weren't really like
it would be a very generous interpretation.
Asking for liberation so much.
They respected the Greeks, tried various self-governance schemes for the region, only to realize that Greek civilization was in active decline, and as the Greeks continually failed, the Romans gradually took over the area. For more details, I would check out the book The Coming Caesars by Amaury de Riencourt, which looks at the parallels between the Greeks and the Romans and modern European...
What is this cover? They're crowning like Obama there. Now, we do know the Clintons and the Bushes have definitely allied themselves more with that era of Democrats, again, with Hillary, obviously, with Bill being involved, and the Obamas, further than actually a lot of the Republican Party now, although Clinton was a Democrat, by those definitions at that time. So, yeah, this is kind of interesting.
And Americans.
Now, the Romans were always primed to overtake the Greeks. That was never an issue. I mean, literally, they derive much of their ancestry and culture from them. And Rome is resource-wise primed for growth much more than Greece ever was. Greece was never blessed with very good geography, which lends itself to economic growth and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Greece is mostly mountains and islands. The other thing is they were never really politically unified in the same way that Rome generally was. Like the Roman Republic has allies, and the allies under their thumb, and they don't have these competitions. So like you go like in Greek history, and the Greeks have like the Athenians are on top, oh the Spartans are on top, the Thebans are on top, and like the Peloponnesian War comes along, and the Spartans win, but they have to get Persian help to do so, and end up largely being under the Persians' thumb for quite some time until the Macedonians take over.
A very compelling way. As Europe becomes less a place of power and more a museum of declining nations, borders will change to make sense to more geographically and ethnically based rather than based off some war in the 18th century. Ethnically split nations like Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland likely split or become part of their co-ethnic nations. Likewise, the UK likely divide with Scotland splitting off, partially driven by the decline of Britain from great power, and as religion becomes less of a sticking point, Ireland will unify.
Interesting with that, like unification of Ireland. Do you think unification of Ireland more logical than being even tighter controlled, say, to like England? But they have England with Scotland. Okay, you got like Belgium, maybe going to France. Belgium's a unique situation because it is so diverse that way. We have Switzerland going into Germany. Yeah, no, they would have done that a long time ago. Okay, Austrians, I mean, potentially. I mean, you had the Anschluss before. You had that.
Best as I understand it, Austria is pretty well separated from Germany at this point.
You got Czechia, Slovakia, if they want to unify. I mean, sure, I guess why not?
As transportation,
And then the Baltic states, are they going to reunify to like some kind of like Estonian empire or something?
has gotten a
That seems incredibly unlikely as well.
lot faster since the Industrial Revolution. Countries like
Latvian
Slovakia,
Empire.
the Baltics, and Scandinavia will form confederacies with their co-ethnics to gain more leverage and power in a world of bigger countries.
Scandinavians, I know you guys are screaming over this because you all are not real fans of each other. I noticed that from my community there.
Yeah, the thing about Scandinavia reuniting is that Scandinavia pretty explicitly split apart because they don't really get along. Like, people are not going to necessarily abandon their ethnic priorities of their own accord. With there's so many years of enmity between them. That's the same thing you could say for Northern Ireland and Ireland. Like religion is certainly a key point in the conflict, but like eventually the reason for the conflict is transcended by the conflict itself. So like people remember the troubles and they remember the fighting and the destruction, and that itself casts a pall far more than the actual split between Catholics and Protestants.
And Norwegians and Swedes, you especially seem to be unified against Denmark, by the way.
As Europe becomes weaker and more inside the American sphere of influence, I think the Americans will buy Greenland off the Danes. Greenland is central to missile warfare, and as the world warms, will probably become the
and Denmark is in no mood to sell it.
Center of the Arctic trade routes, thus making it extremely strategically important for the U.S.
That's what's talked about right now in the current political rhetoric of Greenland becoming more invaluable later on, mostly with mining and stuff like that. But yeah, if environmental factors are going to change, which again, the same people that claim those environmental things with, changing sea levels and stuff, is not really believed about by the same people that want Greenland for strategy, I should say. So it's probably not for those purposes.
Greenland has a lot of liquid natural gas reserves, apparently.
And again, more for militarization, maybe some mineral extraction or something now with Greenland. We're already seeing with Greenland, Denmark is not really interested.
Yes, Maya, that is the alt history guy.
You have to have some kind of massive movement within Greenland. And we've seen United States support those kind of movements a lot. But there's a lot that could happen there.
Center of the Arctic trade routes, thus making it extremely strategically important for the U.S. Due to the collapse of belief in the shared Russian mission as a nation alongside their massive demographic collapse, I don't think Russia or the Balkans will survive. For a bunch of reasons, I'm bullish on Turkey as a future superpower.
Way more than
with the Balkans experiencing the fast.
You have no idea, sir. Demography isn't destiny unless you make it so.
Way more than you collapses of anywhere in the world, often losing half their population over the next few decades. I see the populous Muslim world just moving settlers into the Balkans and Crimea.
Yeah, I don't think those factors are what he's going to think. The two things that control population factors historically are famine and disease. And those are the things that we only have ever seen the type of drastic decline that he is talking about in the way that it would affect things catastrophically, because what he's saying there is going to be a lot more gradual and it has to be more like intentional. But again,
well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Famine and disease are what cause population collapse. However, you have to understand that Whatifalthist worldview is built fundamentally around the concept that race and ethnicity matter more than other factors. So when he's looking at a population pyramid, he's looking at it from the standpoint of, is this racial or ethnic group going to survive? Not in the case of, well, they're going to die out. It's like, do they have enough to continue to be a viable racial or ethnic group? And this determines whether or not they're white, basically. Education. Whose education? Whatifalthist education? Whatifalthist education is a semester of college where he determined that it was too woke for him to continue.
Again, non-intentional forces are very important. And again, famine and disease are the things that have controlled, that make the most significant population changes, something that actually moves the needle in history.
Turning them into cultural extensions of the Middle East. I also see similar trends in the Christian Caucasus nations like Armenia and Georgia, which are under very similar demographic and cultural circumstances. The U.S. doesn't have a lot of culture.
Under what similar cultural circumstances? They're actually kind of isolated from most of it. Like, things in the Caucasus kind of go off on their own accord.
Our strategic interests in the Balkans and would allow this to happen when distracted elsewhere.
Russia's probably more likely, again, based on historical context, go in those Caucasus regions than Turkey. But again, I mean, if Russia has completely collapsed, that could happen. But Turkey, I do have some things to say if when he eventually gets to that. But there is some prime shuffling that could happen with Turkey.
But we would see a frontier develop between Christian and Muslim worlds at the edge of the Hungarian plain around modern
Ottoman Empire
Belgrade,
2.0.
which is the natural geographic choke point. With the collapse of Russia, I see two powers gaining more influence in the void that...
What concern? Population collapse concerns? No, I don't think they're concerned about population collapse. I don't think they know how to order lunch. Like, first of all, the federal workforce is stymieing Trump to their best of their ability. So like they're not telling them how to order lunch, first of all. Second of all, even if it was an issue, obviously, like, here's the thing. I was actually thinking about this the other day. How fundamentally impossible is it to negotiate with Republicans when they looked at COVID and said, this is a liberal plot, not this is a disease that we have to work together to stop? When you are so far gone that even the concept of disease is a threat to your ideology, you're done. That's the end of the discussion. You are no longer capable of deciding things on your own and need to be put aside in a little glass box with a TV with Fox News on it so that you can watch it and real people can get on with their world. That simple. You cannot function if you are unable to recognize actual real world impacts of natural events. Like, if you think wearing a mask is a threat to your safety as an individual or is a threat to your rights, you are out of your goddamn mind. Done. Kaput. It's over. All you're good for is to feed the Matrix. That's it.
Russia leaves in Eastern Europe, the Poles and the Turks.
I'm not so sure with this collapse of Russia. If Russia allies itself strongly with China, then they're going to be able to survive some of the economic problems that could happen there. Now, if they're saying there's, again, civil war for regime change or something like that, I mean, we'll see how that goes, because then again, China isn't as involved. China's always been much more involved with economic imperialism or those type of interactions than political ones.
I see the Poles expanding east, seizing Belarus and western Ukraine, which will become a buffer state between Turkish, Russian, and Western.
You also notice how Whatifalthist assumes everyone is irredentalist, like to an extreme degree, which is weird to me.
Influence. I see the Turks gaining.
Poland is prime for growth. I think it is. I think resource-wise and that kind of thing. Remember, the thing that's always limited them is the rise in power of both their east and west sides, the rise of Russia and then the rise of Germany. When those things are not as much of a threat, we've seen Poland in that region grow more. So I think it would be contingent upon a collapse of Russia as pretext, or I don't know what would happen with Germany, but that happening for Poland to grow, which maybe could be possible.
Dominance over.
But again, it's incredibly unlikely that Russia is going to collapse. Like, Russia is very much. We've talked about this, but Russia's core power base is the oligarchs, and they are unlikely to cede power willingly. So, like, you have to be able to overcome that system. And you saw it. You saw it when the Wagner Group marched on Moscow. Is Russia had emptied out Russia to invade Ukraine, but they were still getting ready to fight. They weren't going to let this just happen. And therefore, in order to have a collapse take place, you have to get Russians to be less comfortable with the current regime than they would be with a potential new regime.
Over the Black Sea, as they have for most of the modern period, using Crimea as a detached peninsula with a large Muslim minority as an airbase to control the region from. I see them allying with Russia's Muslim minority populations that they often have a good amount of cultural connection with, like the Chechens and Tatars, who have the highest birth rates of anyone in Russia, and will only get more populous over time Tatars, as Russia's, especially Orthodox Christian population, collapses. The Turks might possibly split off the somewhat culturally distinct southern grassland of Russia called Chernozem as a buffer. Depending on how much the mission of a unified Russia has failed at this point, Chernozem might continually attempt to join up with the fragment of what used to be.
Reasons a new civilization might develop in Ukraine or southern Russia. New civilizations tend to start at the edges of conflict between dying and aggressive civilization. Orthodox, the West, and Islam, that's not really new civilization. That's not really the case. Like, what happens is you get breakaways, but that's not a civilization. It's a country. You have trouble starting at the core territories of old civilizations, new colonized areas like Ukraine. That's not a complete sentence. Ukraine isn't a new colonized area. It's also very distinct in and of its own right. Orthodox people tend to have initiative and skills, but are betrayed by leadership, so potential is there. Initiative and skills in what? The population collapse here seems like it could be so bad that there would be pressures to do. Why would there be a population collapse? People have cultural memory of fighting Muslims that go back centuries. They also have cultural memory of fighting the Russians that go back centuries.
Be Russia.
I'm interested in seeing this part. Reasons a new civilization might develop in Ukraine, southern Russia. New civilizations tend to start at the edges of the conflict between dying and aggressive civilizations, i.e. Orthodox, the West, and Islam. Well, it needs unifying factors, though, not just arising in the ashes. There have to be unifying things.
It's distinct ethnic groups that form nations out of the chaos created by a clash between larger bodies.
As context for that, to say the rise of Islamic civilization coming out of Arabia that had a unifying factor, a lot of it based off of, one would be like the Arabic language, but it went way past that. But then the Islamic faith having a unifying thing that was able to kind of wedge its way into a dying Byzantine Empire and Persian Empire. And that's what they were able to kind of wedge. But there had to be a unifying force for that.
You missed an opportunity, sir. You missed an opportunity to say Sassanid, which is one of my favorite Persian dynasties.
Number 2, new civilizations have trouble starting at the core territories of old civilizations, but new colonized areas like Ukraine. Orthodox people tend to have initiative and...
Look, Mr. Terry is a much kinder person than me. He looks at that sentence and goes, that's not a sentence, and moves on. I'm going to point it out. Because, as the right-wingers like to point out, I'm petty and mean and a horrible beta male.
Skills, but are betrayed by leadership, so potential is there. Orthodox people, do they mean like Orthodox Christian? Any argument for that is probably going to be more correlation than causation, though. For the population collapse here seems like it could be so bad that there would be pressure to do great things. Okay, that's just rhetoric. 5, the people in this area have cultural memory of fighting the Muslims that goes back centuries. The Turkish invasions might trigger a new sense of cultural unity. It would take a unifying factor from that, but you're going into areas that are not Muslim. That's not going to happen. I mean, are we trying to get the Bosnians to join you there? Again, if you're going to the Caucasus regions, a place like Armenia, which is a Christian population.
Also, spoilers for a future video, I think there's a decent chance that a new civilization develops in this area. Part 4, Africa.
Okay.
There are 2 trends you need to understand.
Look, Africa is the worst part of any Whatifalthist video, so everybody buckle up.
To figure out the Africa you see on this map. The first is that I think the Muslim world will industrialize and become wealthy. This is because that region of the world has commonly been wealthy.
Hang on, the Islamic world already is wealthy. Like what?
Muslim world is not a thing. That's not a thing. There's no more unified caliphate or something to do that. That's like saying the Christian world is going to do something. It doesn't have a lot of weight to it.
Christendom are going to liberate Jerusalem from Christendom.
No, it ignores all the other differences that have kept the Islamic world from unifying as a political identity within the first century of their existence, of the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate.
Also worth noting, Arabic countries have very much attempted this system of like pan Islamic sentiments have always been a significant of the post-colonial Middle East, and it's never panned out at all. There isn't a significant unifying thread. You have all these different Ba'athist parties and conflict, and on a fundamental level, you have a set of societies that are to a certain degree somewhat corrupt. Therefore, they don't operate. They're not able to operate on large scales. So, while you see Islamic and healthy, they're also what you would expect from a oligarchy.
Across history, as well as it's the only major one of the 4 Eurasian civilizations that hasn't industrialized. Even so, we've already seen a precedent of industrialization in Turkey and Iran, which will probably set a precedent for the rest of the Muslim world. However, you see no such similar trend for Black Africa, which has none of the preconditions for industrialization. Thus, when you see this mega
the same ones that happen in the Middle East are going to be the same ones that would happen in sub-Saharan Africa, which is foreign investment, which is exactly what happened. You saw it in Iran. Iran grew that because of foreign investment, but also we saw that that foreign investment also turned to oppression and economic inequality that led to revolutions where they were able to seize those things. Like with Iran, they have a revolution, nationalize their oil industry, and then they have to actually have another revolution. So it did come from that inherent foreign investment. And the rest of Africa is completely primed for that sort of thing to happen. And it's already...
There is a lot of money in Africa to be and the credit of previous administrations, they have attempted to encourage investment, and in some cases they've attempted to investment at least marginally more responsible ways than have happened in the past.
Already happening. Foreign investment into sub-Saharan Africa, especially, is enormous right now.
Morocco, you're looking preconditions for industrialization. Thus, when you see this mega Morocco, you're looking at what happens when an industrialized Muslim country sees the opportunity to conquer a technologically inferior region. This is keeping with the Moroccan tradition of invading West Africa that's happened a couple times and is also tenable since it's pretty easy to build highways across the Sahara for communication, with the Moroccans creating a second...
It's not easy to build highways across the Sahara, by the way. It's not. All easy to build highways across the Sahara. Any remote. Filters. Let's change. All right, let's see if that works better. Not easy to build. Also, highways across Africa have been, and they kind of just hasten the spread of AIDS, because you can fix problems, but you can't fix them. So condoms needed to go with the highways.
Empire across the Sahara and the Sahel. Likewise, I see a similar trend with Turkish influence taking place in Sudan and Northeast Africa. The second dominant trend is that the state doesn't...
So I was wondering if you talk about Turkish Empire. Outside of... The United States is going to determine a lot about what happens here in the western part of the Middle East. So if we're talking about Iraq, we're talking about Syria, Palestine, Israel, all of these places. Now, Turkey has always been kind of this interesting kind of on the fence thing as an ally of the United States. I mean, they were brought in as an ally of the United States with NATO because of their strategic position by Russia, be able to put nukes and stuff like that.
More so because they can control the Black Sea. I've talked about this too. Turkey as the guy in high school with the car that you don't really like, but he has a car, so you have to keep him. That's kind of Turkey. Like, Turkey's kind of tricky. We don't have very firm allies in the Middle East. We have his allies extreme convenience, and it's their convenience in the case of like some country, Israel, or we have countries that have an overriding strategic goal in mind that they think we can help them with. Turkey is one of those.
And United States, yeah, I mean, will and has supported them, at least in some of their initiatives. Some of them not so much. But anyway, the United States will still is going to play a major role in what happens here. If they want the Turks for some reason to really become powerful in the Middle East, that could definitely happen. We've seen historically a lack of Arab unity against...
There is no way in hell that Turkey is going to take over Egypt.
A lot of these pressures dating back to their response to like the Balfour Declaration and the failure of creating like a pan-Arab state, if you want to see that as a failure, but just saying that it never actually happened there. Turkey putting some influence over, if it went all the way down to Egypt or something, that would be difficult too, because something else would have to probably happen with the United States and Egyptian relationship, because there is that one as well. Israel, again, would be an interesting one because Turkey has often sided with Israel, again, which shows that like being Islamic is not going to be a unifying factor if they're going to support the creation of Israel, when parts of, say, like Iran or, again, Arab Palestinians and kind of their plight with their relationship with Israel too. So you do have to have the United States as part of that. But yeah, Turkey would have a lot, probably better chance of going into these other parts south.
U.S. just try to assassinate Turkey during the Obama administration. Not that I recall. Erdogan, he's been kicking for a while.
Of them, okay, into Mesopotamia or potentially, I guess, into Egypt. I think far more than they would the Balkans. And probably more than the Caucasus.
Record in this region, the East Africa. The second dominant trend is that the state doesn't have a strong record in this region of the world and was largely created by Europeans for their own colonial purposes without dealing with local conditions. At the same time, most African nations haven't been able to construct strong national identities, with their governments often being rackets for one ethnic group to extract payments from the others.
Now that is a point to be able to talk about because of the cultural diversity of sub-Saharan Africa, as again the map on the left has cultural identities and the right has political designations that were made from foreign colonial forces. But again, the economics is going to economics will pave the way, I should say, for the foundation of state growth. It's going to start from there, because when economics are stable and there is growth, that can often take precedent over other potential conflicts, I think. And again, it's in these same regions that you're saying are non-state regions that are also the most prime for foreign investment. And
a lot of those regions like have held up remarkably well, all things considered. He is aware that Ottoman Turks are not viewed favorably by Arabs pre-World War I. Who was? Mr. Terry or Whatifalthist? Whatifalthist is not aware of that, no. You can just assume he's not. Like for example, the Congo is not destroyed and turned into multiple little states, despite the fact that they have been in a civil war since, well, forever. Like, you have a lot of these states where, like, Going by Whatifalthist's model would politically collapse because there are mixes of ethnicities and groups that have found a way to remain states. Through violence and bloodshed, to be sure, in a lot of these cases, but they're still like the pull of a nation state is a hell of a lot stronger than some people assume. And this concept of loose nationality is still one of the strongest unifying factors. They tend to transcend certain values. It's only in extreme cases where governments are unable to provide anything whatsoever and they just get destabilized that you see those kinds of collapses.
Foreign investment comes in.
Like, think about it. Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. Despite the fact the Taliban have taken over, Afghanistan is a very tribal area, but it remains its own. People are not interested in setting up their own separate country. So, like, this sort of dichotomy of extreme divisions occurring that Whatifalthist is, this doesn't happen a lot.
Then that you also could see indirect state control from, again, foreign nations that could potentially stabilize, I mean, kind of their force, I guess, as long as all the different ethnic groups are equally participating in the economic growth, there will be less tension that way. So I think it's a big stretch, I think, to say with this non-state territory thing, when it is one of the places most primed for a positive change for stability.
I call the era since World War II the UN Bretton Woods era, given that it's been an alliance of American power with UN politics to basically keep nation states operating even when they have no coherent reason to.
Now he's bringing up, okay, so you got these things on here. And again, if you're listening, I'll read it. The U.S. and third world countries both have the self-interest of supporting nations that don't make sense and preventing wars since, number one, wars disrupt the trade that the U.S. bases its wealth off of and cause trouble. Number two, the U.S. doesn't want threatening empires to form due to cannibalizing smaller nations. Number three, due to the trauma of World War II, empires are emotionally not viable. Now, if we're talking about in 2120, a lot of that trauma that you might be thinking about is going to be very weak, especially because you can even notice it now that we're 70 years removed, how that has become weaker. It's significantly weaker that way.
It's very tenuous at that point. Russia is clearly willing to engage Ukraine. Israel is very happy to invade Syria. And they cut off electricity to Gaza, and then Piers Morgan, who's supposed to be a fucking commentator, what gives him that right? Like, what's the Oslo Accords? Which, if you had a basic grounding in the topic. The U.S. doesn't want threatening empires to form due to cannibalize. Well, no one's really that interested. Irredentist and militarized states are not useful. Are not useful to anyone, really. They're destabilizing factor. Always had that particular. Wars disrupt trade that U.S. bases its wealth off of, yes, and cause trouble. Well, not as much. Like, for example, a war in the middle. Rwandan military forces moved into the Congo, effectively invading it. You haven't heard a damn thing about it. So, like, there are significant economic interests in the Congo and Rwanda both that are carrying on largely without the disruption of this conflict, this border conflict. So, like, this is less true in an absolute sense than it would have been in the past. We have become much better at waging war as takes far less involvement of forces to effectively wage war. Therefore, the all-consuming disruption that occurs in the past from war, not necessarily as felt as have been before. Your country like Kenya or Pakistan, you effectively form a union against any states breaking up, since that precedent forms one that can be used to your destruction. Yes, but that's all countries everywhere.
Okay. 4, if you're a country like Kenya or Pakistan, you effectively form a union against any states breaking up, since that precedent forms one that can be your destruction. Not sure if I follow all these points, though.
This system used to make more sense when most of the third world countries were inhabited by underpopulated peasant communities, but as the third world became more urbanized, literate, populated, and wealthy, political organizations will have to change to represent their identities more. After Asia, Africa is the top region in the world where I expect atrocities and mass death this century, since it's largely the only region that's having ludicrous population growth, which is the big driver for atrocities. Projections show Africa will have
It will, and we've seen a sudden population growth. I mean, I guess atrocities being an effect of that. It will determine how the state can respond to that. That's for sure. We saw it in China. When China has had massive population issues, it puts a lot more stress on the government infrastructure. You saw it with the Qing dynasty. They had significant population growth as global trade increased and reduced things like famine. But then economic inequality came as a result of that. And kind of what I was saying before about the economic growth in this area, especially at first, will be tied to a lot of foreign investment. And if these places are if they are economically growing, but they're politically unstable, you will see intervention in these regions. But we also know that intervention can also create problems, because you find someone that, like, if you're the foreign nation, you find a regime that will support your investment and your ownership of those. We'll use means of production as a term, I guess, that could dissatisfy people and call for regime change. It could eventually ripen itself to into revolutions, into civil war, depending on who these foreign nations are going to support and how those foreign nations are going to act. Are they going to be oppressive towards the people? And when balancing between the needs of their people and their foreign interests, which side will they take?
3 to 4 times China's population, or past 4 billion, by the end of the century, which makes no sense, and so there really has to be a big crisis. I see the old African order collapsing and being replaced by a lot of chaos. I see a laboratory of various warlords, theocracies, and crypto states. I think this degree of competition will actually be amazing for the continent and its future history, since it will create massive pressures towards improvement in creating African civilizations. Sort of like how modern Western civilization was formed in the chaos that came after the fall of Rome. I mean, the main geographic civilization was formed in the chaos that came after civilizations. Sort of.
Yeah, that's not how that works. Like, the chaos that followed the fall of Rome didn't make better civilizations. It was stabilizing that. Like, so Western Rome falls 500-ish. Like, you don't see a stabilization of that until 1,000 years after the fact. Yeah, Africa will have major problems, huge migratory problems that will create conflict due to climate change.
Sort of like how modern Western civilization was formed in the chaos that came after the fall of Rome.
After like 500 years.
I mean, the main geographic problems that kept Africa in poverty until recently.
No, this is just what's the word? What's the best word? The drug-addled brain of Whatifalthist.
Are largely gone. So if Africa can formulate
how Africa's geographic problems have been solved. Few navigable rivers or beasts of burden, highways and railroads, none of those are going to be a problem. Okay, none of those are going to be a problem with foreign investment. Okay, navigable rivers, that's how Africa was colonized in the first place. Through the Congo River, through the Niger.
Yeah, I don't know how you would say there are few navigable rivers. There are fucking rivers everywhere in Africa. Like, everywhere. Like, hang on. There are so many goddamn rivers. Huh. Let's just check. They have 55 international rivers, 150 large lakes. Some of the largest rivers in the world are in Africa. I don't know what the fuck he's smoking.
River through the Nile River. That is the preferred way of navigating.
Heat, air conditioning.
to the heart of Africa, especially initially while you're still laying the way for infrastructure. And it's also 2025. There are airports, there are other ways of being able to do that.
Oh God.
This is like the geographic problems have been solved. I mean, they were solved in the 1800s.
A way to
Like, yeah, in order to colonize Africa, all of these things were solved.
And bad soil
they can
for
achieve it.
fertilizer.
However, I think there are a couple exceptions to this rule. The first of which is ethnically coherent or resource-bearing territories on the coast that I'm pretty sure would survive and form as coherent nation-states. One is the Igbo and
I just noticed that the Congo seems to have migrated from the center of the southern portion of the continent to the west coast.
Nigeria, who could export their oil or the oil-bearing mouth of the Congo River, which would become a hub of trade. Finally, Cape Town, which is always
okay, so
been
yeah, he did talk about how those, I mean, the problems have been solved, but yeah, again, they were solved a long ago. But we are removed from that era because that era of overcoming the geographic problems that he discussed were overcome in the late 1800s with the scramble for Africa. And then they were settled into another phase, post-colonialism, during the decolonization process of the second half of the 20th century. So this would be a whole new set of things that are not related to those problems that he had talked about before.
City-state that's Congo River, which would become a hub of trade. Finally, Cape Town, which has always been a city-state that's belonged to every continent, I can see splitting off as an American ally. Similarly, whenever you get chaotic data sets, you always have a couple outliers. Or in other words,
Cape Town is going to stay South African. It is quintessentially South African.
when you get a lot of little crazy states, you'll end up with a couple large empires run by geniuses that dominate their regions just off statistical chance. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few places that doesn't have a long historical chance. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the...
Hang on a second. Is that Martin Luther King? Right here? That's Martin Luther King, who never ran any state of any description whatsoever. Che Guevara, permanent rebel. Is Hitler a genius?
Just off statistical chance. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few places that doesn't have a long historical chance. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few places
like political
with a couple
ones?
large empires run by geniuses that...
Martin Luther King did not run an empire. I mean, maybe this isn't directly tied with that. Or Shakespeare down at the bottom.
Dominate their regions.
Oh shit, I just saw Shakespeare. The bard, the boss.
Just off statistical chance.
What light through yonder poser breaks, Rudyard?
At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few places that doesn't have a long history of preformed civilization and cultural boundaries, meaning this region has the...
What is he talking about? Yes, it does. It is the cradle of Christianity.
Potential for great Charlemagne's, Harun al-Rashid's, or George Washington's who could form whole new civilizations.
Augustus. Saint Augustus, like one of the most profound Christian thinkers in all of history. Multiple civilizations have inhabited the sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa. Like what the fuck?
Has been tried. It's been left in that's where those genocides come from that we're talking about. Those are people trying to be the new iteration of that. It's not new. It has been going on for a long time. But yeah, I mean, some of the powerful states, I mean, they have come through, like Mali, Zimbabwe.
Although, in all fairness, this state could develop anywhere in Africa. I'm putting a bet on East Africa, which has largely seen the best leadership in Africa so far. Some of the best nations...
No. Egypt? Morocco?
Nation building, and also the formations of what could be the East African
former
Union,
German,
or a federation of Kenya, Tanzania, South Sudan, Rwanda, and Burundi, who plan on forming a unified country. I honestly don't have really high hopes for this working, but of any one place in Africa, I have the highest hopes of this region becoming the empire.
Okay. On their own. Now, the British tried to do this. They tried to expand their empire from Egypt all the way to South Africa, with East Germany, East Africa being the block.
Also, if you think Ethiopia, which retains an immense amount of pride in being the only African country that was never conquered by Europeans, then you think that they're going to willingly give that up? No.
Block. And you actually saw them fight over that in World War I. And that was for infrastructure. They literally wanted to create a trans-African railroad to be able to go from north to south there. So, but yeah, there's some prime territory there for that. But more than somewhere in the West, in West Africa or Central Africa. Yeah, I think I could see that a little bit more from what he's saying.
As the rest of Africa might spiral into war, neighboring areas would seek protection under the East African Union, with a notable example being the resource-rich southeastern province of Katanga in the Democratic Republic of Congo that would sell its resources east through the Indian Ocean rather than west through Kinshasa as it does now. The final spot
depends on who they're going to be allied with. If it's going to be East Africa or the foreign influences that will likely be able to provide, or likely will provide influence over West Africa more than East Africa.
Is Ethiopia, which I think would be the main competitor to form an African empire alongside the East African Union. Ethiopia is the only main country in sub-Saharan Africa to industrialize, and also is the main one that has a large history of a strong state before European colonization.
It was, but it was mostly centered in there. They also had the religious identity of being largely Christian.
Very Christian. Portuguese traders came and missionaries came to Ethiopia hoping to convert them and found they were already converted.
At that time too, with kingdoms like Axum. So separating beyond that border would definitely get into more having to envelop more ethnic diversity, both religiously, culturally. It'd be a similar thing happening out there. But Ethiopia is an outlier. Always has.
I put Ethiopia as one of the leading contenders for a future African empire. Part 5, Asia. The main trend that I see borne out in Asia over this next century is closing the technological gap that Western civilization has had over the last 500 years. In a lot of ways, this is pulling us back into the Middle Ages. And
okay, I'm not entirely certain what substantive technological gap is experienced when you consider that all the technology that Rudyard used to make this video was made in China. Like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, there is no substantive gap that exists. They've got toilets.
In which countries that have had long-standing geopolitical, demographic, or strategic advantages since the time of Marco Polo will again gain dominance over their civilizations. Starting in the West, I've already talked about the Turks a bit in their other continents.
I'm not reading all that right now.
In short, there's a reason the Turks have dominated the Middle East for almost all of the last 1,000 years. They have cultural, geographic, and military advantages over the dispossessed Arabs.
They control Mesopotamia's water supply is not at all true.
I think as oil will probably become less important
than the dispossessed areas. Well, they dispossessed them. So yeah, I mean, coming into that region for sure, then colonizing that region and moving the way they did. Yeah. Their conversion to Islam also made that part of it too, which original Turks were not.
Middle East will revert to the large empires that have ruled it for thousands of years, with the Turks and Iranians being the obvious contenders. I think the Turks will win in a conflict against the Iranians, like they've done the last several times, due to their greater wealth, technological progress, population, and sharing Sunni identity with most of the area.
What substantive gap is there between Turkey and Iran? Audio is way better. That's excellent because I'm not entirely certain what I did. Look, not an audio engineer, historian, not good at any of those things.
The Turks are largely surrounded by failed states. So
man, I gotta think about that because I don't know about that one.
But I won't touch it if it's working.
With foreign support, because NATO, Turkey is a NATO nation, then yes. On their own, completely independent, I have to think about that a lot more.
So this is easier than you'd think.
There are a lot of people who hate Turks in this whole area. Also, I like how he completely counts out Israel, despite the fact that Israel is literally the only nuclear power in this area.
I see the Turks establish. The Turks
Easier
are
than you
largely
think,
surrounded
really?
by failed states, so this is easier than you'd think. I see the Turks establishing a series of client states outside their direct sphere of influence in places like Oman, the Hejaz, and Libya. One of the most fraught decisions I've struggled with in this map was whether Israel would survive.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad he's going to talk about it. There has to be a clear reason why the Arab community is going to unify with the Turkish Empire when they so vehemently were against it for so much of their history, and for the modern history in the 20th century, as they literally were working with like the British to be able to undermine the Ottoman Empire and get their own independence, which they don't get. Gets carved up, of course, by Sykes-Picot Agreement and everything else that is eventually going to happen. So yeah, I think he's really, really pushing that this would just be like this easy thing. Okay, I'm very interested to see what he says about Israel, which Turkey has played an interesting supportive role in.
On one hand, if the Muslim world industrializes, Israel is dead, since it's so hated by the surrounding Muslims. However, the Jews are a
It's not, though. That's the thing. At any point that Israel has had the opportunity to engage with peace openly, they've been able to make it. So when they returned the Sinai, they made peace with Egypt. When they returned territory to Jordan, they made peace with Jordan. When they failed to return the Golan Heights to Syria, they didn't make peace with Syria. Like, Israel's not hated. They are, after 1967 and the Six-Day War, Israel became a fact of life for all these countries. This narrative that Israel is going to be destroyed whenever someone gets the chance is bullshit.
Stubborn people that are hard to kill. And I see the Turks, who have a history of multi-ethnic empires and cooperating with the Jews, in effect working with the Jews to keep down the Arabs.
Is he doing the thing where he just conflates, just like Israel and Judaism are just synonymous things? Rather than,
yeah, is he doing that anti-Semitic thing? Is Rudyard being an anti-Semite? Perish the thought. That could never happen.
saying like Israelis, because what does Israeli going to mean? And is it a broader sense that it can mean more than just Jewish? That it can't transform into more of a secular identity, especially given the diversity of the region?
Objects of their empire.
Well, that's debatable, because Israel's Zionist population is dead set against that, and like hardcore set against that. They certainly incorporate these different groups, Bedouins, Druze, and whatnot, but they don't really respect them as partners in governance. They are at best guests in Israel, and will remain so long as the intention of Israel is to be a ethno-state. So, like, obviously I'm not very generous to Israel as a general rule, because they get generosity from everyone else, and mostly undeserved. But, like, Israel has, because they have nuclear weapons, the ability to dictate to a country, an aggressive Turkey. They have the ability to dictate to an aggressive Turkey what happens. And they are much more interested in taking territory in Egypt and Jordan and Syria than they would ever be in letting Turkey take that territory. Because Israel alliances are a one-way street. You help Israel, they don't help you.
This seems
with the Jews.
Totally. This seems very broad brush painted.
In effect, working with the Jews to keep down the Arab subjects of their empire. However, another point of view is that the Israelis also might be able to create an effective Arab coalition that keeps the Turkish Empire from forming in the first place. I see the ethnic Turkish states in Central Asia that keeps the Turkish Empire from...
That's the Abraham Accords model of things, where we normalize Saudi Arabia and blah, 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 blah. It's failed. It's fundamentally failed because of Israel's actions in the wake of October 7th. This is not going to happen. Like, It wasn't going to happen, but now it's really not going to happen. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, this is like a -6 on the likelihood of happening.
Forming in the first place.
Sorry, I keep rewinding, but there's some
Arab
really
subjects of
important
their
points here.
empire. However, another point of view is that the Israelis also might be able to create an effective Arab coalition
How?
that keeps the Turkish Empire from forming in the first place. I see the ethnic Turkish states in Central Asia becoming allies of the Turkish nation due to the...
It only took an hour, and Mr. Terry is finally broken.
How?
place. I create an effective Arab coalition.
It'll have to completely restructure what Israel is as a state. It would have to become a secular state that doesn't completely bring its identity in a way that's going to be perceived as a foreign colonizing force, because that's what it is. That is the perception amongst the Arab world, that is a foreign colonizing force. So that would be interesting. You'd have more unification probably
That's a fairly accurate perception, because that's what happened.
with the Turks than you would otherwise. But again, it could change a lot. It could change a lot too, because we also know the United States is going to be heavily invested in something like this, with Saudi Arabia and Egypt working with the United States like they do. But it will have to, the demographics will have to change, because.
But again, that doesn't necessitate that. Like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are close partners of the United States now, with a Zionist Israel being an ethno-state. They don't need Israel. Nobody needs Israel. Like, that's the thing. Israel doesn't control resources that you can't get from only Israel. They don't have like anything that other people need except land. And the vitality of Israel historically has been that it's at a crossroads of powerful nations like Assyria and Egypt and Babylon and all these things. Like, so if you want to fight someone in Egypt, you got to go through Palestine. I can fly over Israel now and bomb Egypt if I really want to. Like, its importance as this crossroads is dramatically diminished. So they have a lot less to offer, which is why they function so heavily on, well, we're a very important ally to the United States, and no one can explain how. Because the impression of being an ally is really all that's there. The United States has partnerships all up and down the Gulf that are much more advantageous than Israel. That's just the fact of the matter. Like, the United States will sustain Israel for as long as Israel remains a viable, and the money in particular from groups like AIPAC remain viable in American politics. But beyond that, there's no overriding strategic desire to maintain an Israeli state.
Because this will inevitably bring in Iran. With any kind of coalition that looks like this, Iran will be involved in.
That keeps the Turkish Empire.
And that brings in Russia.
From forming in the first place. I see the ethnic Turkish states in Central Asia becoming allies of the Turkish nation due to their cultural reasons. I redrew the borders here to fit more around actual ethnic borders in the region because
you've obliterated most of the ethnic borders in the region. What the hell are you talking about?
Because as of now, the borders of Central Asia were
the Armenians. What happened?
Literally designed by Stalin to screw over any future independent countries.
Fair enough.
These areas will probably become wealthy and central to the world economy as Asia becomes wealthy and the old Silk Road trade centers grow up again.
Well, and they are growing again. That's China is heavily invested in land-based infrastructure again, building kind of like a Silk Road 2.0, I guess you would say. It's also why, in comparison to that first map that they showed where China went like way up north, China would be way more interested in building up their economic influence west of China rather than north of China, because going north doesn't do anything to increase their trade partnerships. And that's what China wants.
If the Islamic world industrializes, we will also get the second pole of the Middle East. Iran sees power. The countries to Iran's east, like Afghanistan or Pakistan, are largely artificial, unstable, and created for political reasons, and I don't see them surviving. Under those conditions, we would return...
Iran already is the preeminent power in the Middle East. Like, let's be frank. Iraq was destabilized, and that was really the counterbalance to Iran. by the American invasion in 2003. Iraq is probably never going to properly recover because Iran is going to invest a lot of money in making sure that doesn't happen. I have seen multiple predictions that Iran has, in the last few months, obtained nuclear weapons. They have some things to work out, but they are the preeminent Middle Eastern and Central Asian power. No real doubt about that, and will remain so for the foreseeable future.
To the previous situation in which Persia would have a large sphere of cultural influence and allies in the Afghan mountains, but
that Persian identity, a lot of that was severely wounded from the Iranian Revolution. In fact, that Persian identity, a lot of it went away because it was also, some people identified it with Western, being kind of Western, and a lot of them actually emigrated out of the country after that revolution, when the Iranian Revolution, when it became, the Islamic Republic of Iran.
But would leave these geographically tough and unruly regions to their own practical self-governance. I think India will go through a period of painful, intense politics over the next few decades before becoming wealthier, working off the chip on their shoulder from British colonialism.
India is already pretty damn wealthy and becoming wealthier all the time. And a lot more right-wing, by the way.
And then move on to
like Hindu nationalism is a thing now, and it's kind of scary.
Becoming the stable, isolationist civilization they've been for the last 4,000 years.
They're not going to be isolationist. India very well understands that they are in direct competition with China and is acting accordingly.
I don't see Bangladesh or Pakistan as successful states, and so think that as India continues to grow and get richer, that India will suck in both into their economic and then afterwards cultural and political order. India will suck, and so think that as I don't see Bangladesh or Pakistan as successful states, and so
there is not a situation in hell where the Pakistanis will consent to be being ruled by India.
Think that as India continues to grow and get richer, that India will suck in both into their economic and then afterwards cultural and political order.
So it's like India is going to turn into, especially geopolitically, what they were.
There's also this really weird confluence between aggressive foreign Zionist accounts and Indian accounts. Like some of them are the same thing, and I, for the life of me, cannot figure out what they get out of it. It's like the weird confluence between Confederates, neo-Confederates, and neo-Nazis. Like, I understand the relationship there, but like, why are Hindu nationalists so invested in Zionism? It's weird.
When the British ran them, which is ruling over Bangladesh and Pakistan that way. Again, that will depend. Pakistan will be a little bit more interesting, I guess, with what the outcomes could be than Bangladesh with that population too. But it also depends on the cultural movement inside of India. If India is really trying to retain a identity of separating itself from its Islamic history, which
they are violently trying to do to their native Muslim population, by the way.
Largely is why the country is going to be split up. But if they want to go towards getting rid of that influence and not wanting part of that influence, then it would have to take, I don't know, to do this, it would have to take some kind of ethnic cleansing almost.
Which is why I don't see them, like, they're already there. That's where we're at in India. Yeah, the Pakistanis and Indians are both nuclear powers. Like, there is a very legitimate concern about the stability of the Pakistani state. That's very true. But at the same time, the Pakistani state has the capability of firing nukes at someone who tries to absorb them. They won't submit to Indian rule. They certainly won't submit to India as it continues to head in this direction, where they see Muslims being basically ostracized or killed. Excuse me.
And I don't know if India is primed for that kind of thing, but that might be very controversial on the international scene.
As India mellows out and asks to work with Muslim territories, will start to construct its identity around the shared Indic civilization rather than Hinduism. Burma, which is
they'd have to, but I don't know if that's going to be.
Like, that's incredibly unlikely because, again, the core of this identity is Hindu nationalism.
I mean, do you know how unpopular that idea is amongst Indian nationalists, Hindu nationalists of that type of identity? If you bring that up, you'll find yourself in a very heated conversation.
You won't enjoy that conversation. It will be the end of you.
For this region and geographically and culturally connected to the broader Indic world, will also probably end up in the orbit and as an ally to a mature and wealthy India. The main reason I have China eat so much of Siberia and Central Asia is just sheer demographics. The whole of Siberia and Central Asia combined has a population of less than 100 million, while China has a population of 1.5 billion. The thing that's kept the Chinese from populating and settling these areas, many of which can support far more people. I mean, the Chinese side of the border is 200 million people and the Russian is 4.
Is he saying that that expansion territorially, imperially from India will just happen because it can? And because it can, it will?
They do today is a combination of how the Chinese were militarily inferior to the native inhabitants of these areas who were nomads and Russian power.
Oh, no, because you will find in ancient Chinese history, even in medieval Chinese history, that those nomads and the Chinese mixed. Like, they're not military, like that they are oftentimes one and the same. They are, because cultures mix. Sorry, Whatifalthist, I know that goes against your racism, but cultures mix.
Both of which are going to go away.
Overstated, but I mean, it depended on a very specific time period of the nomads of the north under the height of the Mongols from Genghis Khan all the way to Kublai Khan.
I also have much of East Asia join the Chinese orbit since as China industrializes...
That's totally changed. The difference in military power, obviously, of China and those northern nomads today is night and day.
There's no I also have much of East Asia join the Chinese orbit since as China industrializes, it will force these countries into inextricably close economic cooperation. The main thing that keeps these countries from being Chinese allies is that the Communist Party is cruel and morally corrupt. However, in a lot of ways,
they're ignoring World War II. Just completely warring. If we're talking about wounds that still exist.
Yeah, Korea, not happy with Japan. Japan, not happy with China. China, not happy with all of them. And
for China and their relations to Japan, it's World War II. So not to say that he can't say there is, I mean, if there is going to be this level of corruption, but that being the factor that is keeping that kind of cooperation from existing is kind of nuts. Also, it completely ignores the United States, who is the buffer with South Korea and Japan and China. Yikes.
Is that the Communist Party is cruel and morally corrupt. However, in a lot of ways, the Communist Chinese Party is a deviant from most of Chinese history, in which regimes have generally been pretty honorable and not too expansionist.
No. They have not been able to compete as effectively, but they've been pretty damn expansionist. Chinese wannabes.
At the same time, Japan and Korea...
What? Qing Dynasty? Tang Dynasty? His original China looked absolutely nothing like it does now. And it didn't look like what it does even in the bright green area. Those were all from significant military expansion as Chinese civilization started on the Huanghe, Yellow River, and the Yangtze rivers, and then territorially expanded incredibly by the military forces. Again, Qing Dynasty, Tang Dynasty.
Yeah, they were pretty prolific conquerors of the area, just pointing that out.
Wait, the rest are Chinese wannabes. All of those places he put with Chinese wannabes all do not like China. They've
desperately do not like China. Also are pretty fucking Muslim.
Repeatedly tried to resist China through their entire history. Ask the Vietnamese about that.
Korea have been Chinese allies for...
Like, that's one of the principal drivers that allows, like, the United States and Vietnam to get along today, is that Vietnam is incredibly distrustful of China.
For most of their histories, and have a switch that basically allows them to switch allegiance to whoever happens in this powerful country at the time, which is how they've been able to so successfully take up Western culture. What I think will happen is that which is how they've been able to so successfully allegiance to whoever happens to be the most powerful country at the time, which is how they've been able to so successfully take up Western culture. What I think will happen is,
well, those were all part of the Japanese Empire. When they were rebuilt in the image of American culture and consumerism.
Yeah, but again, I don't think he knows that particular part of Russia is disputed.
That's how they adopted that. The Philippines was taken over by the United States. We see what Japan, we literally wrote Japan's constitution. South Korea was built and their regimes pretty much
Also, if you want to talk about countries that are still scary after World War II, Japan still has the impulses that led to everything that they did that was horrifying in World War II. Like, they're just lurking under the surface. Like, Germany takes a very conscious effort to disavow the Holocaust. Japan does not disavow their crimes in the same way.
Picked by the United States as well. These were the United States intervened directly in the rebuilding of these places.
Is that as China collapses into its warlord period, the Communist Party will become more totalitarian and cruel. Then we'll move over to the warlord period, and as a reaction against the Communist Party, I think we'll have a nationalist and socially conservative China, but also one that's relatively honorable. And so all the nations in the area would be willing to work with China. Finally, I see the...
I think he's not misrepresented, but like is way off on the trajectory of China. China very much can continue on the path that they're on right now. They are primed for that because they're seeing a lot of success. Infrastructure wise, they're seeing themselves grow on the international scene. They're filling a lot of the voids that actually the United States is leaving, as so many countries are turning to China for their economic development rather than the United States. And that trajectory would only continue at this moment.
Collapse of Indonesia, which all the nations in the area would be willing to work with China. Finally, I see the collapse of Indonesia.
No, they won't. Basically, every country here in this map would explode before they worked with China.
Which is, again, one of the most fraught decisions I've made here. Indonesia really doesn't...
You haven't made any decisions, Rudyard. You've just slowly diarrheaed into a video.
Make a lot of sense as a country, both geographically and culturally. But the Indonesians have done a pretty good job of constructing a national identity over the 20th century.
That's fair.
And that's not something I covered about in my video.
Well, their identity came from anti-colonialism, as they were, the Dutch East Indies there. And again, wrought with so much imperial influence since the 1500s. That's where a lot of their identity also came from.
Of countries that will collapse, but I do think it's important. I consider the survival of Indonesia a toss-up depending on whatever the leadership involved is. I have the region split here between Chinese and American proxies, with the Americans supporting Java, the most populated island close to Australia, and the Chinese supporting Borneo and Sumatra and other islands that largely view Java as their oppressor, and also they'd sell goods to the Chinese economy. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed...
It's fair. I think that's mostly fair with what he was saying with Indonesia. I actually think what he said about Indonesia, he probably should have said more that there is a toss-up. I think there are more toss-ups than he thinks, but I know he's trying to, take bolder takes here and trying to put that out there. I mean, even he said at the beginning of this that people are looking at these like predictions of his a lot more concrete than he did. All right, so got about done.
As their oppressor, and also they'd sell goods to the Chinese economy. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pearl, Patreon, or Pillar, as well as my social media. As always, it's been a pleasure, and have a great day.
All right, I had a lot to say during that video. I turned a 20-minute video into one that is now over an hour, so I've done like 3, almost 4 times as much commentary on top of the original. So if you bore with me through this entire time, I really, really appreciate it. I'm sure you had a lot to digest and to respond to the original video, and I guess what I said as well. You agree with some of the things I said? Do you disagree with them? Is where you're at somewhere in the middle? Definitely want to hear from you. So hopefully see plenty of engagement down below in the comments, being civilized, hopefully with each other there. And I know you probably got a lot to say. So with that, again, thanks for hanging out. Hey, stay tuned for future history.
Right. Okay. I think he's a lot more generous than I would. No, actually, we can definitely say he's a lot more generous than I am. With that, I think we should call it quits for the evening. I am tired. It's been almost 2 hours. This ran longer. We'll save Brandon F for a different day. Go take your medicine. Everyone, have a good night. Consider supporting our Patreon or subscribing and liking and doing all those things. And with that, I wish you all a very, very good night.